It's good news for Gladiators and Centurions, bad news for some of the best Dreadnoughts. Let's take a look at the Space Marine points changes from the new chapter approved. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're taking a look at the actual reveal points cost from chapter approved, where I'm hoping that we'll do a fair few videos like this, going over the majority of the big changes for each faction. Starting off, we have the Space Marines, one of the ones quite widely previewed by Games Workshop on Thursday, but they didn't quite show off the full story. There's a few other really interesting points rises or decreases within the book. I think we'll start with the core Space Marine choices, the ones from the Codex and Forge World, then go on to the Blood Angels and Dark Angels, then the Space Wolves and Deathwatch. We'll go through each points change and talk about roughly how good I think the unit is now. So first up, to the core of the Space Marine army, the biggest changes are 3 nerfs and 3 buffs. The Redemptor Dreadnought and the Relic Contemptor both went up, as did the Primaris Chaplain on bike. And for buffs, it's good news for some things with big guns, as the Gladiator tank, the Storm Speeders and the Devastator Centurions all went down a bit. First up is the Redemptor Dreadnought, that one went up 10 points, so perhaps one of the most standard loadouts, going to 195 points to 185 with the Icarus Pod, Onslaught Gatling Cannon and the Macroplasma Incinerator. I think it often helps to visualize points increases or decreases as percentage changes, as of course the cheaper the unit, the smaller a points cost change that you need to make it better or worse. Relatively speaking, I don't think it's the worst nerf for the Redemptor. It's only gone up 5% in relative terms. I still think it's a very good gun platform and of course can do some melee, but I think in general it's not the worst one to go up a few points, seeing as really quite a lot of other Space Marine gun platforms are basically flatly inferior to the Redemptor, often putting out very similar firepower but without core and not being able to fight in melee. With how useful and general purpose they are, I don't think that they're going to be going anywhere too fast. I think they'll still be very popular at their new points cost, though obviously just a little bit less markedly superior. In a very long expected change, the Volkite Culverins for the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought from Forge World have gone up. They were previously 5 points each, they've now gone up to 15 points, so if you're running a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought with 2 of those things, then it's going to cost you 170 points rather than 150, plus of course a command point. That's a fairly sizable nerf, at up 13% in points, a much bigger relative nerf than the Redemptor, and I do think that these guys are going to be seeing less play as a result. I think it might mean that a few people might look at some of the other guns on the datasheet as well. Maybe it might be a bit more used as a las cannon platform, as opposed to firing guns that are almost as good against tanks as they are against infantry. I definitely don't think that they're unusable though, particularly for some armies that get an absolute massive amount of value out of them, such as the Iron Hands who can screen them by making one a character. I think they still might see some great use there, as it's worth paying a slight premium for some very generalist firepower. Still though, can't really say it's too bad a change. These things were a fair bit better than quite a lot of the Space Marine firepower, and I fully expected them to get toned down. Finally, back within the Space Marine Codex, and the Primaris Chaplain on bike has gone up 10 points, a moderate sized nerf at plus 7%. I think maybe this has been done because he is a bit of a superior choice to the other chaplains right now. I think the extra speed, mobility and durability is almost always worth paying the taxing cost, though I think if I'd addressed it I might have been a bit more tempted to just lower the cost on the other versions of chaplains that don't see as much play. This guy can certainly be really strong indeed, but I feel like his most problematic builds are only limited to a few relics or certain chapters. Things like the Tannhauser's Bones from Black Templars for example, which are a bit obnoxious on a unit that's got so many wounds. I feel like the bike chaplain might be catching some flack from those when he's kind of fine in most chapters. In any case, I certainly think it's still usable at 150 points, but unless you are running one of those wombo combos like the Bones or a White Scar Smash Chaplain perhaps, I think you really would have to think twice as to whether or not you want the cheaper version. Moving on to buffs though, and it's another round of points drops for the Gladiator tanks. These saw a decent points cut already in the previous chapter approved, but it still didn't really see them competing very well against the Redemptor Dreadnoughts. The core keyword and the melee prowess do seem to have been winning out. In any case, the Gladiator tanks have all dropped 15 points. The 24 Gatling Shot Reaper variant becomes 205 points if you give it the Stobber and the Rocket Pod, and the Tank Hunting Valiant goes down to 225 points with the same upgrades, a discount of around 6 or 7% from before. To be honest, when looking at the Space Marine tanks, I think the Gladiators were already one of the better ones, so I really think people might start experimenting with these a little bit, particularly in the context of Redemptors going up a bit. I still prefer these two over the Lancer to be honest. I feel that would need an extra special points cut if it does want to compete a bit better. Next up, Storm Speeders are going down 10 points each. For example, the Hammer Strike has dropped down to 145 points from 155, down 7%. I feel that previously the Storm Speeders just didn't really compete all that well with the other fast attack choices. With a small discount, I think that they can fill a similar sort of hard-hitting, fast-moving role as things like the Land Speeders now, but still probably don't do it quite as well as the core attack bike for the cost. Still though, far more usable. I think you're a lot less punished for bringing them now. Seems like a good change to me. Finally, and the biggest percentage change out of any of these, is to the Devastator Centurions. They're dropping a fairly hefty 15 points per model. The las cannon ones coming down to 95 points, while the ones with the grav cannons going to 70 points. Quite a nice buff to really quite an underperforming unit in my opinion. Not having core or much mobility or combat, the Devastator Centurions really just do need to be efficient sources of firepower in their own right, or they're never going to see play. I'm still a bit underwhelmed at the las cannon one really. 95 points is still really quite a lot for a 4 wound model. I think I like the cheaper variants a bit better. In particular, the heavy bolters and hurricane bolter combo could be quite nice for Imperial Fist players. That's certainly one way to spam all the bolt shots in the world out of one model. Could be quite a nice option for Raven Guard armies as well, being able to deep strike the heavy firepower for just 1 command point. Overall, from the points changes though, I can't help but think that this is a small nerf to Space Marines competitively. 3 really quite common tournament units getting reined in isn't going to be good news for their most optimal armies, whereas the 3 buffs I'm not really sure are going to propel the units right into the line of being super auto includes, to the extent that things like the Relic Contemptors or the Redemptors were. I feel like this sometimes can be a bit of an issue when Games Workshop tries to internally rebalance a codex a bit. You maybe get a few more units that are perfectly reasonable to field, but the strongest builds do get reined in a little bit. In any case, let's move on to the Angels of Death, with the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels. Starting with the boys in red, and Mephiston has gone down 15 points, becoming 140 points from 155. It's a moderate sized buff to him, he's down 10%, and I think it's perhaps a little bit more interesting as a beatstick character with Wings of Sanguinius. You can get a serious amount of movement of him jumping across the board. I think previously, at the points cost that they were before, both Mephiston and the Furioso Librarian Dreadnought were both quite similar for this. Now Mephiston has had a 15 point drop though. I'd say that Mephiston is probably the better choice of the two if you do want something bounding forward with wings and maybe quickening. I still don't think it's really going to be an auto include for Blood Angels though. They tend to do quite well with cheap fighty captains and lieutenants, and units like the Sanguinary Priest and Ancient. Otherwise though, they also got quite a nice boost in both versions of Death Company, going down 2 points per model. Standard issue Death Company are now 20 points base from 22. Perhaps the more commonly taken version with jump packs will now be 23 points rather than 25. At an 8% drop, I think it's useful but not enormous. But even a small drop on these guys I think is pretty useful for the Blood Angels. A fair few people had been switching to Death Company as an alternative to Sanguinary Guard with all the -1 damage around in the meta. And in particular, I think there's some great first turn charge threat to be had with Forlorn Fury. I think a big unit of these is going to be a really common include in Blood Angels armies now. The Death Company Intercessors have gone down to 22 points base from 24. Again, a -8% points cut. I think they're still maybe a unit that's just kind of fine rather than being massive standouts. They certainly throw out quite a lot of chainsword attacks, but do give up the advantages of being obsec or taking elites with more generalist weapons that can threaten heavies or elites that can move faster. They are certainly fairly durable and very dangerous for the cost though. I just feel that they often struggle to fit in with the grand plan of the Blood Angels army. For the Dark Angels, the Deathwing haven't seen any nerfs at all, and the Ravenwing have got 3 quite helpful points cuts, with the Black Knights and their flyers all going down. The Black Knights have dropped down to 35 points base from 40, that's a cut of 13%, and I think that feels about right for the unit. I feel that they compete a lot better against the other Ravenwing choices, things like the generic bike squads that can get obsec and the heavy firepower of attack bikes. I think that's a really nice change for them. It'll be good to see the elite of the Ravenwing taken to the table once more. On the flyer side, both the Dark Talon and the Nephilim have dropped by 15 points. That brings the Dark Talon down to 195 and the Nephilim Jet Fighter down to 175. I think as Space Marine flyers went, both of those aircraft were pretty reasonable as they go for the Marines. I can't say I saw all that many people taking them in Dark Angels armies compared with more bikes, speeders or Deathwing, but I felt that particularly as you can't spam flyers anymore in competitive play, I don't really think that having the flyers be at least fairly strong for the cost is really such a bad thing. I think perhaps the Dark Talon is the more meta-relevant one at the moment, being able to hand out mortal wounds and a ton of damage one shooting. I think the Nephilim still is particularly good whenever there's loads of 2-wound infantry in the meta, but maybe not quite as good against all the damage one that goes around these days. In any case, I think overall these are some pretty nice changes. Blood Angels haven't been one of the stronger Space Marine factions for quite a while now, and having a small drop on a key unit is helpful. And for the Dark Angels, these feel like small buffs to some of the lesser played units. I think GW have done quite well to make the vast majority of the Dark Angels army very playable and usable in game. Finally, we get onto the Space Wolves and the Deathwatch, and it's largely good news on the point side over here too. For the Space Wolves, there's decent drops on Wolfman and Thunderwolf cavalry, and for the Deathwatch, we've got a buff to the Corvus Blackstar. I think perhaps out of any of the changes in this video, the Wolfman are the ones who have done the best out of the update. Games Workshop have given them a very nice buff indeed, going 2 points down on the base model, so standard Wolfman are only 20 points now. But perhaps more importantly, the Great Frost Axes are down to 25 points per model, and the Hammer and Shield variant are now down to 30 points per model. That's some fairly seismic percentage changes there. The Hammer and Shield are down a massive 21%, and for 30 points for a Toughness 5 model with a 4+ invul, they're at least somewhat tanky, and still hits like an absolute truck when they get to melee. I don't think they're quite back to the stage that they were back in 8th edition, where they were just almost equally durable as they were fighting. But maybe a squad with 5 with 4 hammers just seems like it's a very threatening little unit now, and it doesn't really cost you too much to field. I think it's quite nice to have drops on the Thunderwolves and the Wolfman. They're two of the more iconic and unusual Space Wolf melee units. It was a little bit sad in their codex when it turned out that they were some of the less optimal things to field. The Thunderwolf cavalry have been buffed but not quite as much. They're down 5 points to 40 points base, so for example if you wanted to run them with Lightning Claws and Storm Shields, that would be down to 50 from 55 points. Again, really not too bad at all. That's a solid 10% points cut. I think people certainly will consider them a little bit more against Wolfguard now. They are very big threatening models with a really nice threat range with advance and charge, though I'm still not sure that they're in any way significantly better than the tried and tested jump pack Wolfguard. Talking of which though, the Wolfguard have seen a rather expected change. Their jump packs cost an extra 2 points per model. This brings them into line with the standard Vanguard veterans from Codex Space Marines, and I'm pretty certain that this was just a case of Games Workshop forgetting to update the Wolfguard special version back when they chose to make the change to the Vanguard veteran jump packs. It might cause a few optimal Space Wolf lists to need to find a few points, but jump pack and Storm Shield veterans have remained a staple for Codex Space Marines, and I don't think that that's going to change things for the Space Wolves. Finally, we come to the Deathwatch, and the Corvus Blackstar has gone down by 15 points. That puts the loadout with the Hurricane Bolter and the Ignores Cover Auspex array down to 185 from the 200 it was before. I think that's a small but meaningful drop at 7%. I think it's quite nice if you do want to include their faction-specific flyer, but I'm still not really convinced it's a very necessary unit for a Deathwatch army. All their plays revolve around infantry, and they don't really need this thing to get them there when they've got tools like teleporting or that Beacon Angelus. Still though, if you are choosing to include one, it's now a bit cheaper. So overall, I think the points changes could be taken as a small nerf to the most competitive forms of Space Marine lists, but it is quite nice to see a whole bunch of lesser played units get small boosts. I think out of the buffs, perhaps my favourite changes are the Gladiator boost, the drop to Death Company for Blood Angels, and the drops to Wolfen and the Black Knights. I feel like all of those units were kind of okay already, and these cuts might have just crossed the line to making them into actually good ones that you want to build around. I might have to revisit the Gladiator tank at some stage on the channel, maybe for a new unit review in light of the new changes. In any case, I'll be really interested to hear what you guys have to say about it. Do you like the changes? Were you expecting them? Do you wish they'd perhaps been a bit more far-reaching? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly try and keep a few more of these videos coming, hopefully covering most of the major factions out of chapter approved. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.